All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, whoa, I almost knocked over my microphone. I'm so excited. I almost knocked over my microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We are here with the one and only Benjamin C. George on the George and George episode hour of the No Absolutes, the Terror Before the Sacred, and all things interesting. Welcome to the show, Benjamin C. George. How are you today, my friend?
Another day in paradise, brother. How are you doing?
I am living the dream. Thank you for asking. Before we got started, we were talking about the pitfalls of entrepreneurship and some of the ways in which one can find themselves in sort of a K-hole for those who are familiar with ketamine. It's tricky. You can really pour yourself into something and block yourself off from everything else. And in some ways, I think that's what it takes to be at the top of your game. And you can see the sacrifice. I think there's an old quote that says you can only serve one master. So maybe we could just, before we start talking about some of the new books and new things coming out, what do you think are some of the benefits and the pitfalls of your career as an entrepreneur? Can you tell us maybe a story or two?
Sure. I think while the pitfalls probably are more numerous, simply because that's just the nature of the game. It's try and fail, it's sacrifice and get nothing. It's almost get there and then fall down the mountain and then into the next valley, which you didn't even know existed. Uh, but then when you do get some achievement, when you do start to, crest some hills and then eventually some mountains, uh, it's it makes it all worth it. Mostly because not necessarily that you succeeded in doing something, but you learned so much about yourself, about people, about the world, about you know what the ins and outs of so many different things that we take for granted, nuances that we didn't even know existed. And in that perspective, I think there's great value, and I think that's where a lot of the benefits outweigh the detriments when it comes to the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, that is really well said. And it's I'm a big language guy, and when I think about language and the things I love, I think if you're building something, be it a company or a project or even a process, like if you're beginning this journey of building something, it seems to me you're building a new part of yourself. You're building a new idea about yourself and the environment, and it's kind of like a trip. It's which is takes us back to
Yeah.
psychedelics in a way. Like it is a journey. It is a trip. You are going to stumble along the way sometimes. You're going to have new areas, new lookout points, and you're going to find out probably more about yourself, like you said, than maybe the thing you're studying, or maybe that thing you're trying to build is already part of you. And I'm always amazed at language and how beautiful it is, even though sometimes language fails. Your book, No Absolutes, a framework for life, it's part of a trilogy, which is a great word for language, in a 1, 2, 3 series. What are some of the you have some other titles for some other books? Can you tell us what those are, and maybe start with the second one and explain it a little bit?
Well, it's a pending trilogy.
Okay, fair
Uh,
enough.
they're unwritten, but they're conceptualized. The second one is No Absolutes, a language for life, and the idea being a lot of what we talked about in the course of this podcast, 7 podcasts now, is words are important. How we use those words. You just said, and it's interesting how language often fails us.
Yeah.
Um, and the exploration of that, I think, is a very valuable tool at a personal level, but
Yeah.
also at a communal level and a societal level, because it's a different when we start to look at all these things as not massive lines in the sand and these tribalistic us versus them type
Right.
ideas, but more of a conversation and sharing of information, you know the the comparison of ideas and the ultimate winner of better ideas. We it allows us to communicate at an entirely different level, for one, and it starts to remove some of these very long term isms of society, your racisms, your
Yeah.
sexisms, and all, etc. Uh, because now, the hard and fast lines are no longer hard and fast. They're, well, there might be a line there or there might not. Have you heard what this guy's talking about? As opposed to, we can't listen to so and so because they're blue, or they're red, or they're conservative, or they're liberal, or they're, a Raiders fan or a Broncos fan. You know, all of these little dichotomies that, we can't see the larger picture because we can't see past, the huge tribal giant in front of our eyes, this idol that, everybody kind of suspends their rational and reasonable mind for.
Yeah. It's
And, God,
please. I
I was going to say, so that's kind of, it's kind of the underlying idea behind the second book, to build upon the framework of the first book, to provide a way for the individual to start kind of programming their own life. In because the way that we speak and the way that we think will influence the way that we act, and the way that we traverse through this grand adventure of life. And so that was book number 2.
so let me ask you this. When I believe that thoughts are things, and the word the I forgot the exact breakdown, but it's something along the lines of the thoughts you think become the word, or the words you use become the thoughts you think, the thoughts you think become the ideas you have, and the ideas you have become the patterns of your life. And so
Mm-hmm.
the language that you speak, be it an inner dialogue or be it the words you use to explain yourself, your situation, or others, it's such an important issue because most people do not pay attention to the words they use. They, instead of listening to what someone says, they're thinking about a rebuttal. They're not totally consuming the information coming at them, and they want to respond so quickly, maybe out of respect, or maybe out of necessity, or maybe out of pain, but they want to get it out so fast. They don't take time to conceptualize the ideas they want, and so the language just kind of spills out of them. And when it does that, it's like building a crappy sandcastle. It's just going to fall over. But if you don't
Mm-hmm.
have the good foundation, you can't build the tower that's going to last. And that foundation comes from the words you use, which kind of brings us back to framework. What
Mm-hmm.
how do you use language to stay away from these isms?
Well, I mean, instead of, where do a lot of isms come from? These A lot of these things are because there was absolutism before the ism,
Mm,
the individualisms. And that absolutism was, you know, so and so is superior to so and so, right? That's usually where it stems from, for one reason or another. And there's been so many throughout history. Uh, and as soon as you have that, you have these individual isms born. And so those absolutisms of, one person's better than the other, you know, which, in my experience and my travels, I would say I've never seen a single piece of evidence to support any notion of that. But those are things that bred these ideas into society, and to the point now where, they've lost a lot of their potency because they are used just so willy-nilly.
yeah.
They're thrown at everybody these days. But at the same time, when people are constantly focused on those types of words and framing their perceptions and the things that they see in life in that context, it's no surprise that you end up with just an increasing chasm of divide that we're seeing on a, pretty much a daily basis.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me how some of the things that are supposed to bring us together tend to be the things that divide us most. And when you look at something as powerful as like religion, let's say, let's just throw this monster out there. So, here's this beautiful idea that we are all part of the same organism, or we all can find something greater than ourselves to believe in, to point us in the right direction. And all of a sudden, it is, I heard it said like this one time: religion is like a finger pointing to the moon, but we get caught up in the finger. Like, that's a brown finger. No, 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 it's a white finger. It's pointing at the moon. It doesn't matter. It's got a fingernail on it. It's got too many wrinkles. And it seems, if you look at that metaphor that way, we get caught up in the smallest details. I think
Hmm.
it was Freud who said it was the ego, the monster ego of the mundane, or something along those lines. But we get caught up in these
Hmm.
small little details, and then we fight over those. And I think that that's one place where we could work on our ideas about language to help forge a better relationship with each other. And what is it about these small details that act like gaps or containers to push us into a small box? What do you think that is?
Well, I think it's multifactored, but one is certainly, how all of these things have been used throughout
Mm,
history. And if you look at just about any religion that I'm aware of, they've all been kind of usurped by people who wanted to abuse other people at some level. Uh, and it's really hard to do that, especially like from the Abrahamic religions
right.
perspective. Um, you know, these things are very closely related when you start, especially the further you go back. Uh, and so, how do you differentiate yourself from these people who are just over a mountain back in those times? Well, now there has to be something different in our understanding, our translations, our what our priests interpret. There has to be some difference there, and then eventually those little differences, because they allow people to maintain, gain control and power and resources and wealth and all of these things that humans seem really obliged to pursue.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, magnified by time, you see where, yeah, back it was really close, but then now you see how it's just grown and grown and grown to these divides where now you have, even within the different Abrahamic religions, you have a vast variety of sects that are, you know, very almost 180-degree different from one another, oftentimes in their interpretations and rituals and what have you. So I think a lot of it has to do with, just the nature of humanity, and and maybe not necessarily the nature of humanity, but the nature of humanity historically. I'll say that. Because
Yeah.
along that line of history, we can see all of those occurrences where a thing like a religion or any sort of type of ritual that bound an area together was eventually usurped and utilized for the gain of power and resources, money and control.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. And I like the idea of that being the nature of humanity. You know, isn't human, like, human nature has to be pretty close to the nature we live in, right? And so if we look at nature and we see this constant cycle of expand and contract, whether it's the earth
Hmm.
spinning or it's the glaciers moving forward and then retreating, it seems too that human nature would expand and contract. And I think we've seen that through the rise and falls of different humanities. And why wouldn't that be true with major concepts like religion? Like, you see it expand everywhere and it gets bigger, 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 and then it contracts, and then it gets bigger, 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 and it contracts. And I I think that's similar to language too. I mean, there's all these different languages, and then all of a sudden everyone starts, be it through a pandemic or a asteroid hitting or whatever. It seems that ideas go out and then they have to come back in, just like the tide, right? It's, if you start
Sure.
thinking about it, it's everywhere.
As above, so below.
Yeah, really well put.
And so, these things are seemingly cyclical, but I would say they're more helical in nature. Um, and you'll notice this wave pattern throughout everywhere you look, just like you were about to get into the whole spiel. You're like, oh my
Yeah,
gosh, it's the
from
waves too,
everywhere.
and it's the blowing of the trees, and it's
Yeah.
the yeah. And so, it's radio waves. It's how we're communicating right now. So, we have wireless signals, and those are waves that are, allowing us to send information across airwaves, another wave, right? And
Yeah.
so in all of these mediums, so these interactions, the ebb and flow that you were describing is a really interesting phenomena, because that ebb and flow, like with an idea or something, it'll get to that place where it's just like, aha, it's like an accepted wisdom, and then it'll fall out for the next idea. And
Mm.
it's an interesting evolution if you like start to look at a bigger picture of things, throwing stuff like computing and the evolution of technology and all of these things. And you get to the point where you see that a lot of these ideas, our new products, our new designs, the MySpaces of the world, things that come into this massive thing and then dissipate. um, it always it's continual, but it's not just cyclical. It always advances the notch, and
Mm.
then it goes around, and then it advances the notch, and then it goes around. And so you have this kind of almost helical motion of things, because it does always we're always kind of seeming to move perpetually forward in all of in every way that you look at these things, right? Even if you go back to religion, what we started with, you know now people, it went from religion being everything to, it looked like everybody was going to be an atheist come the year 2000, to there's been a much larger interest in in, I wouldn't say resurgence in religion necessarily, but an interest in religious study, right? And I think that's the next tick up in that cycle of things.
Yeah, it's almost like you said. It's like we're coming around to being more whole. Which when I think of whole, I think of holy. And the idea of the holy, and that brings me to this point. I'm curious to get your take on this. I was listening to a pastor yesterday, and he
Hmm.
had recently been part of an experiment at John Hopkins University with psilocybin, and it was a little bit like the Good Friday experiments they had back at Harvard back in the day.
Hmm.
And this guy, he gave his he told about the experience that he had, and he equated it to, he had mentioned that prior to having the experience, he had never taken mushrooms before, and he was a pastor for like the last 15 years.
Hmm.
And he said that he equated it to just like stuff you would read from a lot of different scholars. And this particular point was that for him, it was like the sixth day of a meditation retreat. He started to feel his body. He started to feel the blockages leave his body. He felt like different
Hmm.
sensations in his body. And during his experience at John Hopkins, what I might call the encounter with the alien or the encounter with God or hearing a voice in my head, he just explained it differently. He said he was being spoken to in tongues. And I could relate to almost everything he said, but he used a different vocabulary to describe it. And what I
Hmm.
found really fascinating about the end of it was that after this process, he started up like a new type of church. And he thought that he started up this nonprofit where he wants to bring back to the Christian religion the sort of Eucharist, like the mushroom as a Eucharist. And he wanted to
Hmm.
start having these retreats and bringing pastors in. And he goes, I think it would be great if I could open this up to the Christian community. And he was specifically talking about Christians, and he wanted different pastors to come to this place and then go back and tell their tribe. And it just made me start thinking about, like, wow, what an amazing cycle of bringing the psychedelic experience back to religion so that everybody can see it
Hmm.
and have it in that context. That could be pretty powerful. On one hand, I was thinking that, and then on the other hand, I'm like, man, this guy's just knocking on the door to Jonestown over here. But it's such a beautiful way. Like I try not to see that Jonestown aspect of it because I think it holds a lot of power. But what do you think about that coming back into religion and psychedelics and maybe moving it back together, something like that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think there's strong evidence to suggest that, psychedelics and religion are pretty closely entwined. Um, you know, the ancient, Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. You have, the Eucharist. You have Soma in India. You have, the fruit of the gods. You have
Yep.
a lot of tales that, like, once you look at a few different angles on it, it really starts to resemble some sort of psychotropic substance, and a lot of times, oftentimes, a mushroom. I mean, I think there's even a temple in Japan, a megalithic temple that has a whole bunch of mushrooms. People call it the penis temple, but it has a whole bunch of big mushroom statues. And so, I mean, if that's not a sign, I don't know what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
um, so I think there is a strong connection historically between psychedelics and religious. Uh, and then, fast forwarding to what you said about how he interpreted it as being spoken to through tongues, you know, I find it very interesting in, going down the psychedelic journey for years and being around a lot of people who've done it as well. Um, People, their interpretations, especially when they get to those like first heroic doses and things like
Hmm.
that, where they really kind of they hit that like aha moments. It's always filtered through the lens of their learned experience.
Right.
And so, like when for him, that is such a foreign sensation. His mental association of foreign sensations is through a biblical context of people speaking in tongues.
Right.
So I could see how that would, that's kind of how his experience developed. Um, but fast forwarding to, now, um, I love the idea of people being open and receptive and experiencing these experiences. The problem is they can go to Jonestown so fast. And
Yeah.
if you look at religion, a lot of religion already is knocking on the door of Jonestown. They're just waiting for a moment, essentially. I mean, it's just wild stuff, where people are being fleeced, and you have, crazy manipulations. And then if you were to throw a psychotropic substance into, somebody who has a 5,000 person congregation who's already fairly rabid and completely, you know, eh, mind fucked already,
Yeah.
well, you're going to have problems pretty quick. Um, so I think the idea is great. I think just like it says in, most religions, it should always be like a personal experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of this I think that's where a lot of the religion side of things, ends up in direct contest with all of the psychedelic shamanistic experiences, is because eventually you get to the point where you start asking the very uncomfortable questions, in a place like that, and people who you've known for 30 years will look at you sideways real fast. So I think there's something to be had there for sure. It's something I've certainly had conversations with people about, in recent years too, just because of the legal nature of how that's all going. Um, so yeah, I think in the future we'll definitely see a new kind of maybe Eleusinian mysteries type idea evolve around a place. Like instead of a Vegas, a city of sin, you have some other city in the desert that's the city of enlightenment.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've been like, obviously I've been talking to cool people like yourself who have a different way of looking at life. I've been I'm hopeful. I've been talking to some people from Cirque du Soleil, and I would really love to pick the brain of someone who not only performs there and interacts with the crowd, but someone who puts on the show for the crowd and thoroughly understands the relationship between a performer, the crowd, and the shared experience. Like in my mind, coming back from California recently, I went to this vineyard, and all I could think of was like, oh my God, this must be what Eleusis looked like. Imagine like a vineyard, and there's all, just valleys and valleys on both sides, and then there's this amphitheater. Imagine
Mhm.
going there and having with this. Now you would have to have probably a invite only or something to begin with, but
Right.
imagine filling an amphitheater with some of the best performers and having, I don't know, maybe like an eighth of mushrooms where you're not bazonkers or anything, and you're not at the top of the mountaintop like taking in everything, but you're definitely at a heightened state of awareness. And then you as a group, you watch this play, you watch this performance, this potential Greek tragedy where someone loses a child, and all of a sudden you're transformed from an individual that came to watch and be part of the show to being a member of the society and feeling the pain of the people next to you. I think it has the ability to be a ritual that transforms people, and I really think there's something to be said about the ritual that one can not only view but participate in. I think those two things mesh together, and I think that
Mhm.
that bridge is through psychedelics, and it's through a new Eleusinian mysteries. And I've really been thinking about that quite a bit. What
Hmm.
what I guess, how would you envision, like, if you were going to put up a new Eleusinian mysteries, what are the boxes you would want to tick, and what would it look like to you?
Hmm. Well, while I like the idea of the amphitheater and everybody there, and I think that is a pretty interesting experience to connect with people in that way, I think the first step is people aren't even connected with themselves.
It's so true.
Uh, and and it took years of pounding on the wall before I finally found the front door. Um, but you know, after you connect with yourself, then I think those types of experiences, like throughout maybe like a given period of time, like a couple week period of time or something like that, I think those would be great to kind of foment, a grander, social conscious idea.
Right.
Uh, but I think initially, there has to be that initial movement, that trip, if you will, that experience that takes somebody and reconnects them with who they are.
That's a
Um,
good point.
and I think doing that is I have a recipe. It's a 3-day experience.
You kind of have you have something that you've been working on that is similar to an Eleusinian experience, and that's pushing your body to the edge while on taking mushrooms. That's got to be its own ritual and experience.
It is. It was with the intent to have a vision quest, kind of in an old school way the first time I did it, and I succeeded. And then on top of that, had a large insight into a lot bigger of a picture. And so, it's a continual thing, just as all things are. But it's one of those things where, most people will be like, okay, how do I take mushrooms? Well, you take,
Yeah.
anywhere from like 3 to 5 grams if you really want to go for it, and go sit in a dark room. I think that's a terrible idea, personally. I think, you start with, you aim for that amount after the course of like 2, 3 hours, but you go in 45-minute intervals, and you exercise and do something physical and in the sun between all of these ingestion periods. And instead of not being able to move off of that, all of a sudden you'll be running up mountains while you're thinking in your head and singing out loud, and didn't realize that you forgot you haven't been breathing. So I think there's a different way to do things.
I have to try that experience. Like it always makes me so thankful. And sometimes I think about, like, there's different ways for different individuals to get to a certain point. And in a way, like, I was talking about how mushrooms can bring people together, but there is this sort of solitude where you have to find your own way. It's almost like you have to create your own lightsaber in order to fight the battle that's right for you. And I think you're 100% right. Like, I think maybe being a little bit further on our journey, or trying or being down this road before, that I know that I have forgotten what led to this journey. And it's like, you just don't start over there. Like, you got to start way over here, man. And you start at the beginning, and you start with the first page and the first sentence, and then you digest that. And you can't start people at the middle of the book. I'm glad you brought that up. It's easy to forget where you started at. But
Right.
yeah, I think that there is. What do you think about the idea that there is sort of a solitude to doing? I guess if you're going to find yourself, you have to be alone. Does that sound accurate, or what do you think about that?
I don't. I would recommend, if somebody wanted to seek this path and they had zero experience, you find somebody who is a shaman of sorts, to walk you down the path. Because, you know, while mushrooms aren't going to kill you, and the experience isn't going to kill you, I've seen some people traumatized,
Yeah.
for long periods of time, just because they didn't know that what they were doing. They were willy nilly, didn't adhere to, set and setting, didn't do any research about the substance they were, ingesting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, 6 months later, they're still, neurotic about the whole thing in life. And, so if you're going to just delve into it, if you're going to dive into this world, I would definitely recommend seeking out somebody. But once you understand, once you get a hold of it, I think it is a personal journey that you take, and you reconnect with yourself and who you are. And I think it's really easy to tell people who've walked down that path as well,
Yeah.
because when you meet them, you instantly say, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" It's
Yeah.
just a different nature to the conversation, right?
Yeah. It's like being like, oh yeah, I've been to Greece. Oh, have you seen that one spot there? Oh, yeah. It's
Hmm.
an environment that you're familiar with, and it's fun to talk about because it's a fellow traveler. Oh yeah, did you check out that dog leg back there, or did you go to that lookout? Oh yeah, no,
Hmm.
I'll check it out next time. What that kind of brings me to the idea of psychedelics today. It seems to me that there is this issue of, you know, it's convoluted. I understand that there's multiple people that need help, and like we probably all need help. However, I think that there's a riff in the community of psychedelics today where some people would like it to be, here's a substance you get from a doctor, and you can go every Thursday and you get this amount, and you have to talk to this guy. You might need a prescription. And then there's other people that are like, look, I'm going to show you how to do it once or twice. And then from there, it's up to you to decide how to do it. And I realize that there's different levels of people. Somebody who has been severely traumatized might be an individual that should probably never do it alone, or shouldn't do it alone for a year or 2 years. And I understand there's levels to that. I guess that's why it's so tricky right now, is some people think you should always have a doctor prescription. Some people think you should be shown the way. What do you think about that divide? And are there ways to solve that?
It's an interesting thing because, the the kid in me who grew up banging my head against that wall and just trying to any psychedelic I could find for a number of
Right.
years, and just having fun instead of uh, working with intention,
Right.
um, he says that, hey, I people should do this in the wild. It grows in the wild. You
Right.
find it in the wild. Live it in the wild. But then there's a bit more of a sensible part of me as I've aged that says, hey, people do have trauma, and all life experiences. Some people just break, and
Right.
those breaks need to be dealt with properly. And if you don't deal with the break properly, you will end up with a problem. Uh, so I think, on one hand, the idea that you putting it all into a clinical setting is kind of wild, because it's very much not a clinical thing. Um, I think, as most people would attest, uh, and putting it in in set and setting does play a huge role into the experience itself. So now, if these places are retreats up in the woods or something like that, that's probably fine. But if you're thinking like a hospital room that's all white and with big old bright lights shining on you, you're going to have a rough time, I think. So and then the other side of that problem is you have the vast number of people. You're going to have, if all of a sudden you have, this is something that gets approved, kind of like a marijuana has at a state level. You're going to have all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people, utilizing psychedelic substances. potentially, and you probably want that a bit more orderly than not. um, that being said, as you well know, on psychedelic substances, nobody's inclined to go get in a car and go,
Right.
joyride. Most of the time, you're pretty much stuck to whatever soft surface you happen to find yourself on about 45 minutes after you ingest something. Uh, but that being said, I think there's probably room for both in the world, and this is where it gets back into the whole society thing of things, where how's it going to roll out? Do you have to pay to play the game? Am I going to
Mm,
have to buy $1 million worth of licenses and whatnot in order to facilitate this type of experience? Or is it just that I'm a guy who, maybe there's a state certification test or something like that, right? Or who knows how they're going to do this stuff. Or even when it rolls back to the guy who wants to do it in a church. Well, what happens if 90% of the people in the church are fine, but 10% have a crazy reaction and start throwing chairs at people? Where's the liability lie? Where's the insurance? What's the cost of all these things? These are when the societal questions start to arise, right? So yeah, I think that those will be interesting hurdles, because unlike a marijuana where people are still relatively lucid, most of the time, you psychedelics, people can be completely gone.
yeah.
You can snap your fingers in front of their face and they won't even know you're right there. So there's a whole bunch of challenges there when you're talking about safety and whatnot, and safety of patients, safety of property, safety of all sorts of things. So I think it's an interesting development. I think it'll probably start out in those mountain retreats, clinical environments, something that has $100 million in VC money,
Yeah.
and they're taking X amount of people for $5,000 retreats for 2 weeks, right, or a week
Right.
or something like that.
Right.
I think that's probably how it'll end up playing out, more of a privatized thing like that, just
Yeah.
because of the massive hurdles from a communal/societal perspective.
Yeah. I could see that in so many ways. And it's not a bad business model if you're a VC and you can get some
No,
psilocybin from Canada or from a lab here that's pretty much pure, and you can get it for, if you're talking 5 or 10 grand a trip, man, like that's an expensive trip on all levels. You know what I mean?
well, I
Like,
mean, that's what these people doing these ayahuasca tours right now are making
are
bank.
they really? I had
Oh yeah.
what's it cost to go on an ayahuasca tour?
Well, I think there are some in the States these days, like in
Hmm.
LA, of course. um, but I was looking down in Peru and Ecuador, and they're usually $3,000 to $5,000 for a week experience or so.
Hmm.
So they're making pretty good money too. And it's became such a popular thing, these ayahuasca retreats, with like kind of like your LA type scene people.
Yeah.
And so they're they're making a good mint, and I think so. There's a lot of people looking at that from a VC perspective and going,
Right.
on one hand you got a Burning Man, and then on the other
Yeah.
hand you have these ayahuasca retreats. I think if we put them together,
Yeah. I wonder now, is that 3 to 5 grand? The thing about Peru or South America is you also get an option for malaria too, if you pay the
well,
right price.
yeah. I mean, I was down in Central and South America for 6 years of my life. Never never ended up with malaria. I never got a malaria shot.
Nice.
I had to get a couple. I think the only forced vaccination I had to get was going into Ecuador, and I had to get
Mm,
yellow fever, um, which I was fine with. I didn't feel like getting yellow fever.
yeah.
I looked up the symptoms of yellow fever, and it didn't sound all that pleasant. So I decided that that's okay. I'll take the jab in the arm. And yeah, but didn't have a problem with malaria. A lot of those places, like, unless you go to one of those authentic, like, an actual shaman in the jungle type
Right.
scenario, a lot of those ones that are charging money are, you know, air conditioned cabins that,
Mm.
you're only 20 miles from the largest, a large city, probably, maybe an hour from the airport, something like that. Because all of those Peru, Ecuador, you're right in the hills already. You're already in the jungle. All Central America and Costa Rica, Panama, you're 20 minutes from the jungle. You're an hour from the beach, no matter which direction you drive, pretty much. So I think, a lot of them, you're going to be fine when dealing with that type of stuff. But some people are unlucky with that. I
Yeah.
know quite a few people who just showed up for, hey, it's my 10-day vacation. Oh, I have malaria. I'm like, how'd you do that? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
I'm living here.
Yeah, it's in some ways it seems so romantic to me to be able to do that down towards the Amazon or Central America. That just seems like, and maybe it's just a romantic notion, but it just seems like, maybe it's because the literature I wrote or some of the people I follow, but it just seems like that's, where you could have the ultimate experience. But the truth is, you could probably have a really good experience being somewhere comfortable in your own environment. Maybe
Mhm.
not somewhere like that. I think that you can get a lot out of that experience if you if you just decide what you want out of the experience, regardless of where you are. I think you're going to get closer to solving some problems. But it comes
Well,
back to intent, like you said.
yeah, exactly. Intent. And when you start to work intent like you work a muscle, you
Mm,
get you get
well put.
you get a lot better at it, and eventually, especially when you're active and doing these things, you're flexing that intent constantly because you're you're being forced to interact with, if not just nature, other people and whatnot. And so, working that intent muscle, eventually you get to the point where you're really very much in control of not just your thoughts, but the whole experience of the experience,
Yeah, I
and
think
you're guiding
yeah.
yourself through it, essentially.
I think it brings us back to the idea in the beginning we were talking about building your own business or building your own company or building your own idea in entrepreneurship. And one thing that I have found about particularly mushrooms is that it does take you to the mountaintop in some ways. And by that, it gets us back to language. Like if you get high, you can look down on things, not look down in a way that's negative or putting things down, but looking down at things from a different perspective. You know, if you, and this idea of getting high, like, if you're going to be in a battle and you want to ambush somebody, you want the high ground. If you
Hmm.
want to see things, we want to get a 360-degree view. The people in the prisons have a panopticons because they're always looking down. So if you get
Hmm.
high, you can see things from a different angle. And that's true of any idea that you have. And I think when people use whatever substance it is to get high, you should be thinking about that. Okay, if I want to get high, I should be looking at my situation from a different perspective. And I think getting high sometimes has this, it's almost like a pejorative. All these people are getting high. Like, yeah, I'm going to get high so I can see things better. And I think you
Well,
can
it's very,
use drugs like that to see and make your life a little bit better.
yeah, I think it's very much, it's probably still more a pejorative than it isn't,
Yes,
right?
it is.
But that again, that ties into the importance of words, right?
Yes.
When somebody hears, "Oh, you got high," one person, through their lens of experience of interpretation, will look at that person as some sort of degenerate, who's just wasting away their life, whereas another person will look at that person and understand what you just said and be like, "Oh, they're on a journey,"
Yeah.
and they're trying to see things from a different perspective. Um, Meanwhile, it's the same word,
Yeah. Yeah. My
but all of the
my
other words influence all of those perspectives.
yeah. Not only the perspectives, but if you are one of these people that sees people who get high as wasting their life, then you're not even open to the idea. You're not even giving them an opportunity to explain what high is to them. And I think that gets us back to language as a framework. Like so often we never define our terms in a conversation. And so
Mhm,
people either side monologuing or they're just talking past each other. And that, I think that this is another way we get to these isms. It's like we have these
mhm,
predefined ideas of what that word is, and especially from different cultures. Like if interpretation means translation, and if we're
mhm.
interpreting and translating different, we're not even talking, man. So maybe everyone should be getting high more often.
Well, that's one thing I loved about learning Spanish is because, you know, while there's a lot of things that translate, there are just certain things that you just can't translate. And until I understood enough Spanish that I understood, the way that the words went together, the way that the language was structured, the intonation behind things, the nuances behind, uh, implied context and positive and negative
Mm,
connotations and all these little nuances that language has, all of a sudden, those phrases become beautiful.
yeah.
And part of that beauty is the inability to translate it, because that language defined such a particular framed it so particularly well that you just can't actually articulate it in a different language to the and have it mean what it's supposed to mean. So, it's really interesting when you have situations like that in language, and I always love those. Um, and then I had a point, and I got distracted by my love of of untranslatables. Yeah, what were we going?
We talk about
Um,
Spanish and how like the double negative or seeing language that is unable to be translated. So you have a different context and you have a different framework and you have a
right,
different relationship with your environment that way. Like in German, they have words like Schadenfreude, right? Where you're a
right,
little bit excited when somebody has like a bad day, or there's just different. One word can be a whole nother concept that people in another language can't even think about because they don't have a linguistic pathway to get there. And these people,
right,
like that takes us back to Sapir-Whorf theory, that the more complicated and bigger the language, the more articulate and more intelligent that group of people is going to be. And I know it's a theory that is contested a little bit, but if you took, and I actually got into a bit of a debate with my Hawaiian friend who was telling me, like, we were talking about language and how different languages allow different cultures to see the world differently. And I brought up this idea of Sapir-Whorf, and he's like, "You have no idea. Like the Hawaiian language, even though it only has a 13-letter alphabet, is so much better of a language because people don't thoroughly understand that you could just put a little accent on this letter and it changes the word." And I'm like, "Wait a minute. Can you tell me the last time someone with a big alphabet lost to someone with a small alphabet?" He got all mad at me. He's like, "What are you trying to say? Like violence is the answer?" It was a good conversation, but
it's that's an it's a really interesting idea. I would say it probably much more resembles a bell curve.
how so? What do you mean?
I would think that there is a certain saturation point where a language can get too big and too diverse to where it becomes too burdensome to properly articulate something efficiently, and then it
Mhm.
starts to lose some of its efficiency as it gets to a larger and larger point.
Just like English right now, like you see it peak, or maybe even Latin. Latin splintered into like all like France, and it's splintered into all these different languages. The same way that there's different dialects of English that have split off into like either Ebonics or Pidgin, and there's all these offshoots now.
Mhm.
However, if you listen to Christopher Hitchens or one of these people who were educated that thoroughly understand the canon that is the English language, you're automatically like, whoa, this person's smart. Even if they might not be, but they have a command of a language. It sounds like they are.
Well, there was also people were much more eloquent back in the day because
Yeah.
instead of spending time scrolling and looking at our phones, digesting media, the entertainment of the day was the dinner table.
Yeah.
It was the dinner party. It was, and in order to be heard in an environment like that, you had to be able to articulate yourself in such a manner that people that commanded attention and respect, and presented your ideas clearly and concisely. And we don't have a lot of that anymore.
even storytellers. If you look back to the days of the Homeric verses where people would gather around and it was always the storyteller. And with storytelling comes cadence, comes eye
Mm-hmm.
contact, hand movement, new words to surprise people, to think
Mm-hmm.
about that. Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that.
There is, and are you a fan of Isaac Asimov?
I'm sorry?
Isaac Asimov,
Isaac, yes, he's got the rules for AI, or the
right?
right.
Did you ever read? He had a series of short stories called the Black Widowers Club.
No, I haven't
You
read
ever hear
that.
about that?
I know, but I will write it down.
It's interesting because basically it takes the idea of the old school dinner party, and kind of puts like it's a mystery twist on it.
Hmm.
And so, you have the guests who are, a prominent lawyer, doctors, different high stationed people in society. And they all come for, a dinner that's prepared at this one restaurant, and it's always a different theme. And then each week, one person has to bring a guest that has a problem, and that guest will have some sort of mystery for the group to solve. And so they all just sit around talking about different perspectives of it, how it could be, done in such a way, or how a theft could happen this way. And it's funny because it's usually always the butler, the servant guy, who is the smartest one in the room, who gives them the hint to get the answer. But they're wonderful stories.
Oh, I gotta read. I can't wait to read that. The Black Widowers Club, is that what it's called?
Hmm.
Man,
So we lack. When's the last time you had an experience like that, where you gathered with a whole bunch of people who were just, really doing well in their own positions in life, and then were posed a challenge as a group from all those varying perspectives? That just doesn't happen.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
yeah, but think about if it did, because, as we were talking about a few episodes ago, you have expertise, but then you have the experience of generalized knowledge. But now you can mash up both in one idea, one room, one challenge, one debate, if you want to take it that route. But imagine if we were still doing that, where instead of, worrying about somebody's political leanings or whatnot, you were just taking the intellectual experience and sitting down with a group of people and posing challenges to them in interesting ways, while in the course of having a good time with in a dinner party and whatnot. What greater solutions could be had? What sort of, because oftentimes, it's that one little thing. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been had a programming problem, and I'm talking to somebody who's not a programmer, and they say something that's not about programming that allows me to solve my programming problem, because I'm like, aha, I didn't even look at it like that. I was looking at it from this
yeah.
perspective. I didn't even look at it like that, and all I had to do was just expand my horizon just a little bit. And it took somebody one sentence from some random conversation. Now imagine if you took that and bottled it into a room with a purpose, with an intent.
Wow, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, that should be something. Like you said, I guess that was done all the time. I don't know the last time I was at a dinner party. With COVID and
Well,
working and trying to do
and
stuff.
even dinner parties over the past 30 some years, there's
Yeah.
always the group of kids, there's always the person who
Yep.
has to leave early, there's always the person who shows up late. It's usually a potluck or a barbecue or
Yeah.
something like that. There's never a dedicated focus to it. I mean, maybe people got a game night or something, but you know, it very there that just doesn't really exist in kind of our society any longer. And I think that is a tragedy. We lose out on a lot of perspective and conversations and things that actually, moving the needle towards people actually understanding the world, as opposed to people, understanding less and less through, headline,
Yeah.
as being their
Being
only exposure to what's happening in the world.
Yeah, like that seems like the erosion of community too.
Hmm.
Like we've just gotten away from we've
Yeah.
we've traded in the real thing for the illusion of, like we have all these Facebook friends, or we have all these friends that whenever I clamshell my computer, it's back into my own world and somewhat fulfilled, however, longing for contact in a weird sort of way.
And I think you don't reach the same level of discussion.
Agreed.
Nothing gets as heated when somebody can sit up and or stand up and very animatedly act out their passionate position about something,
Yeah.
right 2 feet in front of you. You're never going to get that in a series of Zoom calls, and you're not going to even get that in just an everyday type of conversation, because the same hoopla wouldn't be going on. People wouldn't be ribbing each other and goading each other. You just don't, because things just don't translate, right, unless you're in
Yeah.
person sometimes. And in those heated moments of passion, in those animated, you know just explosions, that's when people have profound ideas or say things that make people belly laugh for the next month
Yeah.
while they
Yeah.
think about it over and over and over again. And it's a travesty that we're missing out on that.
Not only are we missing out on it, but it's almost as if we're trying to we're trying to we're trying to get that out of the God dang it, that's not the right word. It's almost like we're trying to relegate that out of community. Like when, oh, let's all do online school now. It's almost as if we are trying to purposely get rid of the felt presence of the other. Like we don't, on some level, it seems there's an element to society that does not want people together. Like, I don't want you sitting next to one having that discussion. I would like you on the computer doing it.
Well, I think you could take that from a lot of perspectives, right? I
Yeah.
think from a big tech perspective, that's our goal. We're designing our algorithms to glue as many eyeball hours to our website as possible.
Mm.
So their self-interest is always going to be that. Then you have, you could say that there's other people who, like from a position of like politics and power, especially depending on what country you are in the world,
Yeah.
they certainly don't want people sitting around and having a group conversation, because now all of a sudden people say, "Oh, you feel that way too?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, me too." And that's how revolutions start.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, depending on where you are in the world, it's very much frowned upon to live that way. And I think, you know, the combination of that and other things, a lot of the profit-driven motivation for all things, as we've talked about, uh, I think that kind of entails itself to, what we're seeing, this erosion of community.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's deliberate explicitly, but I think there are certain parties, interested parties, who are definitely, explicitly interested in the erosion of community, and in the erosion of nations, and in the erosion of, power structures that stop them from continuing what they want to do. You know.
Okay, so this brings me to the idea of your helical model. If if we're moving forward and it seems like we're moving upwards, doesn't it also seem like we're eroding them? Like how can we square that, or how can it be that we're eroding community and that we're eroding relationships, but still having the illusion of moving forward? Can we do both of those things? Aren't those
Well,
in contradiction?
I would say they're not in contradiction. I would say, those, you know, just as we were talking the ebb and flow earlier, those
Yeah.
are things that, you know, they have to be taken out of the equation in order for us to see how dramatically bad some of these ideas
Hmm.
and directions and structures of society can be. And eventually it has to get to the point where it does fracture, so we can build it back with the proper intentions behind it.
Hmm.
Yeah, again, as above, so below. It's the same idea behind building up a muscle, lifting heavier and heavier weight over time. You're tearing down the internal muscle, but it builds back stronger and stronger and stronger, and eventually you can, you're benching 300 pounds, right?
Yeah.
I'm not,
Yeah.
but some people are.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it can almost go full circle to you're building this business. Oh, look, you just got 5 million views. Oh, guess what? You're off YouTube. Now you got to start over again. But it's not as hard the second time because you've already understood the road to get there. You've
Right. You
already,
understand the mechanics, the processes, what ideas work, what ideas didn't. You're not wasting as much time. You become more efficient.
and you can put in this. You know what? I really wish I would have done this the first time. So as bad as it sucks to redo it, let me just put this stuff in over here, and then that won't happen next time. Or in some
Hmm.
ways, I look at, we had just spoke about how being on the computer stops us from having true community while giving us the illusion of community, and we talked about the ebb and flow, and I think something similar to what's happening with Zoom versus talking to your neighbor is something similar that happened between radio and television. Like we went from having radio or reading, which Marshall McLuhan calls cold mediums, because you have to do all the thinking, you have to do all the mental image processing and building the story in your head.
Hmm.
When you read Isaac Asimov, your dinner party of the characters may look different than my dinner party. However, if we
Hmm.
went and watched the screening of that movie, we would be given that information. We would all have that same look at it. So
Hmm.
that particular muscle of visualization in our imagination becomes atrophied. So too does the community become atrophied when we use the computer like that. So I guess that's another pattern of moving
Hmm.
forward but losing, and then trying to build back better. I don't know if I I think that we lost out a lot on memory and lost out a lot on conversations and visualization. And then we tried to build it back with the computer, but I'm not sure that it built it back better. Maybe we're just in the middle of that process or something.
No, and it really won't. I mean, even when you're talking the most awesome VR stuff that exists,
Yeah.
and there are some awesome VR stuff
Yeah.
that exists, or when you put on like first person view for drones, and you can fly like a bird for 4 miles, in any direction. These things are really awesome, but it still does lack something. It's still not the whole experience because all of your senses aren't involved in the experience.
Right. Right.
When we're having those conversations, all of our senses are involved in that
Yes.
experience.
Yeah.
And to your point, we have much more senses than just the five. We have that inner vision sense. We have a magnetic sense. We have a lot of different, interoception. We have a lot of these things that are removed from the equation when we start to replace that time with the computer or phones these days.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. And maybe it's just a part of getting older and remembering, I think everybody has this experience when you're younger. There's always some old guy that's like, it's not the same, man. You kids today, or
Hmm.
they're living in their ideas, and you don't understand that until you start to become that guy or that girl, and you're like, well, when I was a kid, and you can see
Oh
the
yeah.
look on the kid's face, like, oh, gee, here it comes again, But I think maybe that is something that if we're mindful of, we can, especially guys our age or guys and girls our age, I think that we're in a rare position that you can take the lessons that your parents or your grandparents lived through and take out the best parts of them, or at least the parts that or are told the best and can learn, and dust them off and give them to the next generation. I think that there should be some sort of rite of passage for not only kids, but for middle-aged people to go through that. Like, look, now you've reached this age where you're the bridge between the old and the new. One day, like you were the new, you're not quite the old yet, but now your job as a middle-aged person should be to translate those times that your parents had and give them to the kids. And also tell the old people, like, hey, these kids are doing well. You just don't get them, But there should be some sort of rite of passage for us to go, hey, we're the bridge now. I think that we could benefit from these rites of passage at all ages of life. And maybe that's part of the psychedelic experience. Maybe that's why it's kind of coming back into it.
I, I, I mean, you could definitely say the psychedelic experience is the rite of passage. I mean, that definitely, it's one of those things where if it was done in a proper manner in a society that was, not just tolerant, but also supported the whole idea. And it wasn't, in a community where everybody was on board, was speaking the same language in the sense that they defined their words the same. you know I mean, there's a lot of nuances that you would have to
Yeah.
account for, but I think if you did that properly, I think having a psychedelic rite of passage would be a good thing to do. When we look back at like the ancient mystery schools, or even when
Yeah.
you look at like the old trade schools, when you had,
Yep.
the journeyman, and all of these things, those, it was a similar system. All of the intermediate, people inside the school, or inside, the whatever trade it was, those were the people primarily teaching the younger people.
Yep.
And then you had the old journeymen who were, overseeing thing, and then you had the really old journeyman who ran the whole thing, and he would kind of wander around and put his fine touch on everything, right?
Yeah.
And that type of structure, I think there was a lot to be said about it, and I think there's a good reason that it existed in throughout antiquity for so long
Yeah.
in various different forms in schools, and you know throughout, even, you go to Egypt, you go to Greece, you go to, India, you go to all these places, and it was the same idea. So there must be something to the idea, is kind of my takeaway from that. And I would agree with you. And I think that, not only that, but we're also really miss the ball when it comes to the elderly in our society.
Yeah.
These are people who, they become a burden to society because it becomes a cost thing. You throw them into retirement homes to just wither and die when they've lived 80 years of experiences, have untold amounts of knowledge. You know, Not only that, they have the knowledge of the previous, two generations
Yeah.
before them.
Yep.
And, you're just going to, and yeah, you don't want those people teaching 30 kids. That's not what you want. But sure, a day in the garden with somebody who spent 50 some years of their life gardening every day professionally would be beneficial to anyone, right?
Yeah.
And instead of having a community that facilitates that type of thing, it's all money driven. So then it becomes to the point of, well, you can pay us and we'll take care of them for $5,000 a month, but yeah, we're not gonna, but this is the package. But if you want the premium package, we'll bring in a personal trainer for them. We'll do all of this stuff, and then it just becomes this thing that kind of just goes to absurdity, but and ultimately misses the point of the incredible resource that those people are.
Yeah.
And it also, it detracts from, those people's experiences, their life. It used to be one of those things: respect your elders, which
Yeah.
I'm more of the idea that respect is earned, but at the same time, there is a lot to be said about that. And it's not the respect your elder; it's respect somebody who's been able to live this long. For one, I think
Yeah. Good point.
that's where it starts from. But then also, have some respect for the summation of experiences that that person has, because undoubtedly there's going to be at least a few, more than likely a lot more, that you have no concept of, and those are all could be valuable experiences for you. So again, I think that's just another one of those where we really just drop the ball. And it seems wherever education comes up, we really drop the ball,
Yeah.
sadly.
I agree. I think that there's something to be said about that structure. And you can still see it. So I mean, you can see you can see the architecture of it. Like if you look at like a good school, you have like maybe the professors who should be the wise men or women, and then the teachers who could be the journeymen, and then the students. Like you can see the structure. It's just that, and maybe this is what happened. Maybe this is why it got this way. Is it just like all structures, it tends to become corrupted unless you do the hard work of repairing it from time to time. And there's
Hmm.
people in positions of authority that are there because of who they are, how much money they have, Whereas we've gotten away from the meritocracy of it. Like this
Hmm.
person should be teaching that. That person gets it. And what makes a teacher? Should someone in their 20s be a teacher? I mean, have they had enough life experience to really be a teacher? I don't know. Maybe some of them, but maybe there should be some other requirements. Like maybe instead of having to pass a written test to become a teacher, maybe you should have to have a resume and have to have letters of recommendation and pass the test. Maybe you should have to have some sort of experience in the field you're teaching instead of just been sitting in a classroom. It seems
Well,
to me that there should be
but
something there.
well, yeah, I would agree with you. But then the problem comes to the practicality of it, and the reality of that situation is teachers don't get paid enough
Right.
to for that to be a viable pursuit for to go off and gather all of that experience and then to go get paid $33,000 a year
Yeah.
is kind of like an
Yeah.
insult. I mean, it already is an insult, and then if you were to go off and do that, I think it's even more of an insult to the tune where you just wouldn't end up with enough teachers to service all of the children. So
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about this, over the years recently, and I think this is one of those places where technology can really, really kind of bridge the gap because what you can do is, I mean, and there's some pretty cool ideas like brilliant.org has done some pretty cool stuff with learning and mathematics and STEM type stuff. Um, and you have things like Wikipedia, which is awesome if you use it properly. And well, it was awesome. I don't know how it's doing these days. You hear a lot of stuff, but uh, but if you combine these resources and you have interactive classes that are available 24/7 to children and anybody for that matter, and then you have additional supplementary classes like you would go to the YMCA and take a class type
Mm.
idea, and those are the classes where you learn the finer granular ideas behind a subject or a particular trade, or kind of like we used to have machine shop and metal
Yeah.
class and wood class and all of
Yep.
these things. You know, it would just be things like that, and instead of having uh, instead of it being in a building all day, it would be in combination with physical exercise, practical applications of things like gardening, like
Yeah.
having a student garden, because how much do you can sit there and read 12 books about irrigation, about landscaping, about gardening, about how nutrients, about all these things, or you can go out one day and watch one person who knows what they're doing do it and tell you what they're doing and why they do it, and you have such a better picture of the process of the system that it is. So you know having multiple aspects of learning where it's not just sitting in a classroom and you use the digital side of things to take care of the more of the memorization, the learning of dates, the historical events, things like that that are okay to be described in that type of manner because essentially it's just like reading from a book anyway, but it's a 24/7 access. And then you just kind of have an elective system for the rest of this the more intimate subjects where you can have a teacher that does have the experience, that went and traveled for 6 years doing botany down in the Amazon or something like that,
Yeah.
and is there for the summer to teach about exotic plants. And and then when you have that type of system, I think you could make it financially viable to the point where the school, the organization would be able to afford to pay that expert who could come teach for the summer about exotic plants.
Yeah. See, this is a brilliant conversation. I really think that we are at the forefront of shaping education. And I think that's a big part of the chaos right now is if you look at
Mm-hmm.
traditional education, regardless of, well, I can't say regardless, but it seems to me in education in primary school, kids around the world are taught, they're a language, they're taught, which is also a framework for looking at the world. They're also taught mathematics and science, but they're also taught like this thing called history, which it's so ambiguous. Like histories are just different, and now
Hmm.
that we have become closer together, it's more in the forefront than ever that history is just a bunch of bullshit that was told by the guy that won the war in this particular area, and they don't match up around the world. Different calendars,
Hmm.
different times, different environments, and so I think part of the chaos we're seeing is this dissolution of history, this idea that, okay, look, we got it wrong. No one really wants to admit that, but we're wrong about all this history. And so there's chaos everywhere, and people are fighting because they still want to. When they lose their history, they lose their identity. And there's a lot of people that have made lots of money that their whole world is based on their identity. And now that the foundation of their identity is being eroded, they feel like they're going to die, and maybe their
So
identity might die.
I want to interrupt you
Yeah,
right there
please,
because you said
please.
something interesting. You said when people lose their history, they lose their identity,
Mm.
and this is something that I've observed to be relatively true in my experience. But it's interesting when you said that because it popped in my head about what we were talking about before about finding oneself,
Yeah.
and I think that's true because when we're looking at the absolutism of these histories that we ascribe ourselves to because we don't know who we are, so we're only who we're told we are and what
Mm.
we're a part of. Now that can be removed from us if these histories go away or we can find out they're false or what have you. uh you know when we find ourselves, no one can take that away. And I think that's an important thing about that psychedelic journey. It's called ego death oftentimes if you're looking up at the
Yeah.
old internet forums and whatnot. And I think there's probably better articulations to it, and I think it's much more of a process than a singular thing. It's much more granular. Um, but in that process of knowing thyself, you know, we we remove those attachments to those weights that would pull us down off the top of our mountain. And history is one of those, and definitely the identity through history because of our inability to understand and know our place in the world. I think has been, like you said, abused and used pretty consistently. But I think again there is a solution for that.
What do you think that solution is?
I think it's exactly what we're talking about. It's a new type of Eleusinian mystery. It's having a structured psychedelic experience like that. 'Cause I would hypothesize, and I have a little evidence to support it, that if done well, it's a consistent experience that people have where they realize that, oh yeah, I spent my entire life as Ben, but now I know I'm not just Ben, and I'm not all of those things that Ben was attached to and all of that stuff. Now I see the world in a different way, and that identity, that perspective, that shifting of ego is, I think, something that could be utilized as a solution to that problem. Now, can you do it on a grand scale? That's where all of these things come into problems, right? It's like, it's cute to do it for a community. In fact, it's probably great to do it for a community, and that's probably where it should be centralized.
Mm.
But then the idea is if, well, it works for one community and then 10 communities want to do it, is there going to be problems at scale? And the answer to that question is yes. Um, and so you quickly run into these, again, it's like a lot of these are great ideas and they will work at certain levels, but then you get into how do we apply these solutions at a larger scale. And the problem, and we're running into it all the time through our conversations, is just that, you know because of the structures that exist right now, the way society is built, you really can't do these things, whether that be because of law or resource or location, or you're just bound in one or multiple different ways that kind of take a little bit of wind out of the sails, but a little bit's enough for these to either, sink or swim type idea. So I think the grander solution to that is a gradual solution where, we can build kind of these conceptual communities that are people with who are like-minded, have the same ideas, and are essentially signing up to be, you know, lab rats in a sense, but also signing up to be, entrepreneurs and, live a startup life in another sense, because that's what it would be. It would be kind of a combination of things where, it would be a full-on entrepreneurial experience, but it would kind of be a group entrepreneurial experience.
Yeah, that. So I got a couple things. Like when we look at it through that lens, like do you think that us in this conversation, particularly us, for me anyway, for me seeing maybe for the first time history being stripped away, can I look at, maybe I should look at it like I see my history, the history that I was taught, the history that I knew, I see that falling away from me. And maybe this is something that every individual goes through. And it's just, I am seeing, because I see it being stripped away from me, now I see it being stripped away from the society. And maybe this is the scaffolding of my ideas being fallen apart because I'm ready to move to the next part. And that's why I can begin to see it in the community, is that I have gotten to the point where I am okay letting go of this pre-made history that was given to me. Now it's sort of a rite of passage that, okay, now you're ready to start building. We can start letting go of some of these things that you were holding on to. And you just see, because you're allowed to do that, now you can see it happening to society. Does that sound like
That
something?
It's wonderfully said. I would say it sounds like no absolutes.
Thank you for that book. Thank you for the framework. Yeah, it's I I can't, I know I say this all the time, but I really enjoy having someone to talk to about these ideas, because it does help me understand where I'm at, where my family's at, where my community's at. And like you said, it's so above, so below. And I feel talking to you and some other people in my life have really helped me see the world differently. And I'm thankful for that. I I'm real appreciative of it. Thank you for letting me explain it like that. I think
Yeah,
there's something there,
absolutely.
and it helps me help other people.
I, which is, thank you for that, and that's wonderful. I mean, that's only ever been my goal, is to, hopefully pass on some information that helps somebody else, and in doing so, to hear it, to have it resonate with somebody who's, 1,200, 1,600 miles away from me,
Yeah,
and then have, 7 beautiful conversations so far,
yeah,
and to break my personal ice on podcasting.
yep,
It's been a fantastic journey for me, and I think it's been a fun conversation so far.
yeah. I agree, and I it's been rich and rewarding. And I like just going back for a second. I really think that has, maybe this is something everybody goes through. Maybe this is something that is taught in different
Well,
mystery schools like that.
absolutely. There has to be the acknowledgement. Uh, you have to let go of your previous attachments.
You have to. You have to.
You have to. I mean, it's one of those things. It's if if we go around this cycle and you don't release your previous attachments, you don't go up to the next notch because they
Yeah.
weigh you down. And so then you're just going around the toilet bowl, and that's not fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not. It's so rewarding, but at the same time, it's scary. It's hard to let go of
Yeah.
things because you're not quite sure. But I'm looking at my bookcase right now, and it's just, sometimes I just sit in front of my bookcase like this and look at all the damn books and start being like, what is it that's tying all these together? And it's like, dude, these are all stories that I have read and in a way lived through by reading them and consuming them. And then all of a sudden you realize, hey, here's my book in my bookcase. What does my book say? What part of my book is a amalgamation of all these people's books? And then you start thinking like, you know what? I've I've participated in all these lives of these people. And you start seeing the things come together, and you think about history. Is it fiction or is it science? It's both. And I don't know. I'm excited for the future because I can see the scales being ripped away. I can see the rocket leaving the launch pad and like the parts coming down as the explosion happens. And it's awesome to be investigating these parts. I'm super excited.
Me as well. I think it's a very interesting time.
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree.
it's it's not without its turbulence for sure. And but at the same time, from just like who I am as a person, you know, to if I was to wake up when I was 12 years old and you were to tell me that the world was just going to keep on going hunky dory and there wouldn't be too much chaos and you would live to about 85, 90 years old and then you kick the bucket and it's just going to be the standard average thing versus it's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah,
My 12-year-old would take the wild ride every single time,
every time.
every time. And I
Right.
think 12-year-olds are a bit more close to the natural human condition. And it hasn't been nurtured out of us so much yet.
Yeah. But stay curious, right? I think that that's
Mm,
some of the best advice you could ever give anybody.
indeed, I agree.
Yeah. Benjamin C. George, absolute blast, my friend. And I feel like the conversations are getting better. I got, you know what? Let me, you got a few more minutes. I got some questions
Yeah.
here that people wanted us to talk
Oh,
about.
sure. Absolutely.
So we got our good friend True Patriots, and we got our friend the Metallic Man. And these guys want to talk about some topics that are happening right now. So let me just fire
All right.
these off at you here. We'll start with this guy, my friend True Patriots, right here. He's asking us, the big topic of the day is the FBI and the 87,000 agents in America coming our way. What say you about the FBI raiding the Trumpsters Mar-a-Lago Palace and then the
Hmm.
87,000 agents? Let's start with the first one, the FBI. What do you think?
Well, you know, it's it's such a dicey thing to have these federal agencies that don't have some form of mechanism of removal of power structures. It's kind of the same idea with the people who live in DC on the Hill.
Yeah.
They're the makers and shakers. It's not the elected politicians. It's the people with all the connections to all the lobbyists who've been
Yeah.
there for 20 years who can make 5 phone calls and get something added to a bill at midnight before it goes to the floor tomorrow. And the same type of infrastructures and uh, you know ability to circumvent channels, if you will, exist in all of those alphabet agents. Um, and so what do you say about them rating Trump? I really don't know.
Yeah.
There's, unless they announce something, it's really interesting the timing of everything in relation to midterms. Uh, and along with everything else that's happening in the world in relation to midterms, when you factor in what people are projecting to be, a high Republican turnout, and now you try to, you're doing everything you can to stifle that. From a political perspective, makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, and that's how those people operate. So, is it a coerced action? Probably, just because of the corruption in the institutions themselves. Uh, but beyond that, I mean, I don't think it's like any grand signifier of like a crossing of the Rubicon or anything like that.
Yeah. I on the topic of the FBI and three-letter agencies. It wasn't that long ago that Hillary was getting invested for her server, and it wasn't that long ago that Watergate happened. And I think what you're seeing is a lot more of the same. You're seeing, but it's like you said, for those people that are watching this FBI invade Trump, you're just seeing the power structure from a different angle than you did when you were a kid. It's been happening this way. This is the way
Right.
power works. It's
Hmm.
just now you're getting to see it from this level instead of this level. And pretty soon you'll see it from this level and then this level. But the song remains the same. And instead of focusing on the idea of the FBI invading Trump, I think you should try to focus on seeing it as for what it is. It's a group of unelected bureaucrats trying to get your attention over here so you don't see what's happening over here. Like,
Right.
it's a show, it's a reality show, and it's becoming more and more bread and circus. Than it needs to become more wild and wild to keep your attention so that you don't focus on that which is coming your way. As far as the 87,000 agents, look, the amount of money needed to run the operation is escalating, and that means we need more people writing tickets.
Yeah, the 87,000 agents thing, which, the troubling with that, it was 4,500 firearms and 5 million rounds of ammunition.
Yeah.
So not only are they hiring 87,000 agents, which, they say if you make, first they said, I think, they're not going after anybody but billionaires and millionaires. Then they said it was anybody who makes over $400,000 a year. But I would hazard a guess that the most likely scenario, based on IRS statistics, which is like, the in your tax bracket, I think the people who are most likely to get audited are people who make from 40 to $100,000 a year, and if you claim the earned income tax rebate, you are 4 times more likely to be audited than anyone else. So when you look at those statistics, and then you add 87,000 agents to it, and then you subtract the amount of millionaires and billionaires in the country, there's a lot of people that are coming for the middle class.
Yeah.
And then to arm them is kind of interesting. I mean, I understand to a degree why you would arm IRS agents, but I don't know. 4,500 guns sounds like a lot. Sounds like a Pinkerton militia type thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the people who have the most money also have family offices, and they don't operate in one currency. They have banks
And
in
it's all
every
out of
country.
trusts, and yeah,
Yeah, they're
yeah,
protected. You're not going to get
yeah,
their
exactly.
money.
Yeah,
And then
and then the tax laws are written in such a way that it doesn't matter if you declare that you're going after millionaires and billionaires. You're just going after millionaires and billionaires who didn't pay the right accountant.
yeah.
That's all that
Yep.
is.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, there's only so many of those people, and it certainly isn't 87,000. I think the last time I checked, there was only 33 some thousand millionaires in the entire world.
Wow.
So far cry from 87.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that the world of politics is fascinating to watch, but you should be mindful that you're you're getting into an area that you don't have a whole lot of control over, and it can be debilitating in some ways if you get stuck there just watching that, and then you fall into that trap of like, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that. But in reality, you should be worrying about the politics of your own life and your family and your friends, where you can have some kind of play in there.
Right? Which is a really interesting thing. I, I've contended for a while, and I've had quite a few debates about it. That, by and large, a person's vote in most Western countries doesn't really count anymore. Um, Now, where that argument kind of breaks down is where you get to really local level type
Right.
stuff. Just because that's much harder to manipulate, and it's much less valuable on the other end to get a payback from. Uh, but at the large scale, it really kind of holds true in most places. And so to lose yourself into something where you have no power to influence it
Mhm.
is just asking for nothing but a never-ending string of anxiety and stress.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember a few years back coming to the realization, like, you know, I think by some means we're all political animals. Like, we want what's best, we want what's
Well,
that.
we're
And
tribalistic. We're
yeah, we are.
tribalistic. Yeah,
Agreed. And you can't on a local level, you do have, if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of influence, then you can influence people on a local level. And
hmm
I remember watching and learning about, if you want to know what happens in your country, just look at what happens in other countries, because it's the same thing. It might be a different shade, but the same way that there's a a communist ruling class in China, so too is there a ruling communist class in our country. The
Mhm.
same way that we look and we go, look at these people in Russia, man. There's so much corruption with their politics. Like,
Oh,
it's the
you
same
call
over here.
yeah, you say, oh, the Russian oligarchs, and then it's like, well, who's that in the United States? It's the
Yeah,
Clintons, it's the Bushes, it's the Obamas, it's all of it's
yeah,
it's all of those families the Kennedys who've been in power for forever. you know,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I like there's she's not really a young woman, but she's a very intelligent woman by the name of Catherine Austin Fitts for people who are curious to look her up. And she was the not the chairman, but the secretary of housing, I think under it might have been under first George Bush or the second George Bush. And she was telling some stories about her background in geopolitics and what's going on now. And I like what she said. Someone was asking her about what she thinks is happening as far as the world around us. And is it the Western people that are the problem? Is it Europe and the United
Mm,
States, or is it China and Russia? What about these lines of division? And she says that I like her theory, and her theory is that we are in the transition to a technocracy right now, and it's not that China and Russia are that much different than the United States and Europe. It's just that in the United States and Europe, we have oligarchs that are running everything. We have the large we have the large corporations like the World Economic Forum that have gotten together and said, look, we're going to do world government through a corporate structure. And you have China and Russia that said, no, we're going to do technocracy through a government structure. But regardless of what color the car is, the world of technocracy is here. It's this world
mhm,
of data-driven ideas
mhm.
through behavior and licensing. It's just, if you look at Russia, you go, oh well, look, they just pulled Jack Ma aside and said, listen, you're not going to be the billionaire running stuff or the government running stuff. And over here we have the
Right.
oligarchs running stuff. So it's black cat, white cat. They both catch mice.
Indeed.
So
And I think that's an interesting outlook on it. And I would agree. We are moving towards a technocracy. We've
yep,
pretty much been there. And I think that's why we're seeing the erosion of nation states and the
yeah,
fracturing of things. And yeah, and to that point, it's nobody's the bad guy. And it ties into our previous
yeah,
conversation where it's society took its revolution around
yep,
things, and now it's time to notch up. And
yep,
it's just like we don't have any monarchs anymore that are pulling all the strings. Yeah, we have a couple figureheads still sticking around, but they're pretty much the last of a dying breed.
yep,
And then it'll be probably a time not in the too distant future where we'll look back and the idea of nation states, and there might be still a couple kicking around, but the idea is becoming a dying breed.
yeah,
Um, and we've talked a lot about language and communication, and I think part of that is just the underlying force, if you will, is the simple act that we're all talking to each other now. So while we have lost a lot of the communal aspects of the dinner table and the dinner party, what we have gained the ability to have conversations at a global level. And because we've started having those conversations, I think that's why we're seeing the next edge up in our cycle here. And I think that's why the things that are bad are now showing themselves as being very bad, and everything's breaking at scale. We're seeing the fractures of all this stuff because now we can communicate, we can have a conversation, be like, hey, did you know this was happening? No, I didn't. How could that be happening? I know, right? And so that changes, and then when the local thing happens, somebody goes, oh, no, 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 I heard about what they did over here. I don't we shouldn't do that over here.
mm-hmm.
And so it changes those conversations, and it's been changing those conversations since the advent of global communication. I think we're in that, we're part of that fomenting of that change.
Yeah. And that brings us back to the people out there that are worried about the politics in your nation, whether it's Trump or Z or the falling of your economy or the uprisings of people in poor areas. Instead of focusing on that part of society breaking, I would try to inspire you to see this as an opportunity to build something where that's going to fall, or at least start paying attention to, hey, all this stuff's breaking over here. Okay, what does that mean? If that stuff's breaking, then we need a new foundation. Or if that stuff's breaking, we need a bridge. Instead of focusing on all these parts that look like they're chaotic and breaking, look at them like an opportunity as like, oh, you know what we could do here? We could do this. Hey, this is the first time we could ever have that. Start looking for when you see the cracks in the foundation, look for the sunlight coming through. See how the shadow falls, but understand what is that? If there's a crack in the wall, what is it shining light onto? What is this? What can you see now? What is that shadow showing? But see it as an opportunity, and it'll take away the anxiety. It'll take away the stress and replace it with a glimmer of optimism. Whenever you see a crack in the foundation of the wall, see it as sunlight shining through instead of something breaking down. And you'll start finding that the people around you are more of an asset than a liability. What is this person upset about? Why are they upset? Oh, I see why they're rioting. And then you can find that common ground to build something on. And for my friends right here, True Patriots and the Metallic Man, look, we all got strong opinions on things that are happening, but see them as opportunities, not to do something opportunistic to someone against you, but an opportunity for yourself to grow. And I think you'll see the world better.
Well said.
Thank you.
I think it's through, you can't have order without chaos.
Yeah.
And it's when we define order from chaos that we, that is the kind of the foundation of what differentiates us from anything else on this planet. Is we have a fairly unique ability to take chaos and make order.
And that's something all of us have. Like we all have our own way of doing that. And I think too, I know that I used to get stuck in this hole and this idea of like, oh, there's all these people with all the power and all the authority. But in the grand scheme of things, I think everybody has the ability. Like, I think the halls of power are kind of empty, really, when you start looking at the leaders.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that guy's in charge, really?
Oh yeah. Oh no, it's a clown car, at the head of the thing,
right?
Which is I find comforting personally. If it was a centralized cabal that had all of their shit wound tight and had been working on it for thousands of years and had everybody under their finger, there's not a lot of opportunity.
Yeah.
But when you got a whole bunch of people just kind of shooting from the hip, there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. You have a lot more potential of getting further in life than you've ever even imagined if you just start looking at it from that angle. If you get away from the oppressive idea that people control you, or there's people in charge, or someone in authority knows what they're doing, chances are you know just as much as that person. Maybe you didn't go to the same school, maybe you didn't come from the same family, but I guarantee you've been through hardships in your life that have earned you a spot at some of the highest levels if you're willing to believe in yourself. And I just hope people take that for what it's worth, because it's so true. And we need more people that have been on the bottom to sit at the table, right? I think there was an old saying that said something like, right. There's just one old saying that people talked about that said, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu. So just force your way to the table.
Well, in my perspective, everybody has a seat at the table. If they so choose to sit there, that becomes the question.
Yeah.
And yeah, I echo your idea. We do need more people who want to sit at the table and have the adult conversation and do the things and, change the world a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're doing here. At least that's what I tell myself. And ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin C. George, the first book of the first book's out, and it's called No Absolutes, a Framework for Life. The trilogy is in the works. We've talked a little bit about the second book. We'll be talking more about those books coming down later in further conversations. Benjamin C. George, where can people find you? What do you got coming up? And do you want to leave the people with anything else?
As always, benjamincgeorge.com. I will be having a No Absolutes podcast coming up here in the next couple of weeks.
Nice.
George is going to come be a guest, and I'm saying that live so he can't say no to me. And yeah, looking out into the world right now, especially right now, it could be a completely chaotic thing. But when you bring it just to yourself, your family, and you start looking at things and you remove the absolutes from your life and you start taking things with a grain of salt and looking at things through perspective and lens and realizing that the words that you use identify not just your thoughts but your actions and the results in your life, all of a sudden everything that you could possibly want to do in life, want to achieve, every success that you think you might want, you can go off and do it. And the roadblocks, the hills, the mountains that you thought were there before, you realize they were actually just mirages in a desert.
Wow, that was really well said. Really well said. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we got for this week. This is out right now. The podcast audio will be up in a little bit, and you can all the links will be below. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll talk to you soon. Aloha.